Hey folks, we are back at NG Atlanta. I'm here with Chaela Womack. Now, if I remember right, you work at Career Builder?
I do.
Awesome. I've actually been there. I did some training there a couple of years ago. So,
Oh, did you like it?
yeah, it was fun. But yeah, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about you and RxJS.
Yes.
So before we get going, I do want to just really briefly shout out about Progress and Kendo UI. They sponsored me coming out here and doing these interviews, and it's really been fun to just talk to the speakers and just get a feel for what's going on out there in the Angular community. And one of the things that I think is one of the hidden gems in Angular is RxJS
Yes.
and observables. So do you want to just briefly tell us what you talked about in your talk?
Yeah. So I talked about some of the core concepts of RxJS. A lot of people don't go into depth with learning it because they aren't using it in very complex ways.
Right.
But when you do start to dive in and use it for state management, you kind of need to know some more of the principles behind it. So I discussed some of the core principles, and I also discussed some operators. So if you're new to RxJS, this kind of gives you an overview, but if you have some experience, hopefully you learn something new about one of the other concepts.
Yep, absolutely. It's interesting. It reminds me a little bit on Adventures in Angular. We did an episode back in the Angular 1 days, or it might have been early Angular 2.4 days. But we talked about promises because initially everything returned to promise, right? And so once people got that, we got all kinds of emails from people going, oh, this totally changed the way I do things. And now it's observables.
Yes.
And so it's not just it's using RxJS under the hood. That's kind of nice, but it's really understanding what I'm getting back out of Angular. Like, what is it giving me? How is it operating? How does it expect me to interact with it?
Yes, and I've actually been amazed. Like, all of the speakers have mentioned RxJS at some point in their talk. And so if you're new to Angular, that's got to be kind of confusing because what is RxJS? So hopefully this helped some of those people. But I did used to think of observables as promises, and I mentioned that it's very easy to compare them to that until you get to a certain point, and then you need to move forward.
Right. So what are the basics of observables then for people who are just kind of getting into this or are making the transition and going, oh yeah, that might be good to know?
Well, it's really built upon two parts, the observable and the observer. So without the observer, nothing's really happening.
Right.
I also discussed hot and cold observables because that's something a lot of people don't touch on, but it's something that's important when you have multiple subscribers. And then after that, I just discussed the most important operators there are. And so I talked about 5 of them, and including error handling.
Right. So observables are essentially just a stream of events, right?
Yes.
And then you have subscribers that take whatever comes off of that stream and consume it one way or the other.
Yes, they react accordingly based on your callbacks.
Right. So some of it can be, I'm going to take this stream and I'm going to modify what I got and give you a different stream. And then others are, I'm going to take whatever's there and I'm going to react to it in some other way.
Yes.
I'm going to cause an effect somewhere else.
Yes.
So, So where are some of the more common places that people are going to see observables if they're just doing kind of vanilla Angular?
Well, I frequently use it for state management. And so if you're using NgRx, you can still use observables. The operators are still possible to use.
Right.
And that's something I don't see people do that often. But just for minor UI events, you can use observables, state management, HTTP requests with the Angular module. So there's a lot of possibility, and you can be creative and go above and beyond and use your own way.
Awesome. So how is Career Builder using observables?
We are using them in many different ways. So like I said, state management is the most complicated way I think to use them. But just for minor UI events, especially when you're waiting on components to interact with each other, it's a great way to use observables.
Right. Cool. Now, what kinds of things did you show off in the talk? I mean, do you have examples of all of these different kinds of observables?
I did show some examples of just very basic observables and talked about different behaviors based on the type of notification. I also did some marbles diagrams because my talk has the name marbles in it, so I had to do that. And that was for the operators.
Awesome. I think that's actually a really interesting way of portraying what the operators are and how they work.
Yeah, I actually like that because sometimes looking at code is kind of hard to digest. So seeing a visual representation helps.
Yep, absolutely. Because it is basically a chain reaction.
Yeah.
That's really great. So do you have any other materials out there on observables?
I do not. This has actually been my first talk. So this is all I have.
Your first talk ever?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, really appreciate you dropping by and talking to us about this. I'm going to encourage people to go check out the talk if you're interested in learning anything about observables or how Angular uses them or anything like that. And yeah, thanks for coming and talking to us.
Thank you.